Oh, baby, finally, man. It's horse beef. And Arman Tsarukyan's putting down the sandwiches. He's putting down the sandwiches. He's finally not ducking fighting in general. And he's risking his spot finally. He's finally living up to this tweet that everybody who calls Ilia Topuria a duck and is propping up Arman Tsarukyan has been propping up Arman Tsarukyan for obvious reasons. It's not because you like Arman, it's because you dislike Ilia, right? So it's an easy opportunity to call him a duck, and you know what I mean? It's fucking obvious from the beginning. But you've all very conveniently been ignoring this tweet, which, as I've been saying, I have to give credit to Arman for. He has finally lived up to it, because last time we saw him compete was the beginning of 2024 at UFC 300. By the time he fights fucking Dan Hooker at the end of November, it will be nearly 2 years since we had last seen Arman in the cage. Right? And that's assuming this fight even transpires to begin with, because, I mean, with the track record of Arman, the track record of Hooker, would it surprise you in any way if this fight completely falls through? No. So the UFC better have a backup fighter on the way, is all I'm saying, really. So it turns out that all this influencer nonsense from Arman Tsarukyan was for nothing, really, because he did what he was told in the end. He did what he was told. He's now going to fight Dan Hooker for what can only be seen as a number one contender fight, right? And obviously it's not an easy one for Dan Hooker on paper. It's hard to see him winning, even though God knows I'm rooting for Dan Hooker in this one. Absolutely. I mean, the guy comes to bang every single time. It's not even like Arman Tsarukyan is a particularly boring fighter. He actually is not at all. But of course, Arman's antics have put him in a position where I have to root against him at this point. I do. I have to root against him. Plus, some of Dan Hooker's trash talk on Twitter is kind of funny, and he does roast Arman Tsarukyan's ass quite often. Also, prayers for strength to Nina Drama's boyfriend. He's very much in need of it. So if he was to go out there and actually finish, imagine he finished Arman Tsarukyan, how funny would that be? How funny would that be? Dan Hooker really has the chance to do the funniest thing ever. He does, right? But ultimately, this fight is just the one to determine who gets stiffed by Ilia Topuria next, because I believe that he stiffs both these dudes, in all honesty. And realistically, as much as I am rooting against Arman here, because I do like Dan, right? Dan is just a fighter's fighter. He really is. You know, he's injured a little bit too often, but he's a fighter's fighter. When he's in the cage, it's hard to really think of a fighter who really does embody a fighter the way that Dan Hooker does. But I'd be lying if I said I'm more intrigued by a Dan Hooker versus Ilia Topuria matchup than an Arman Ilia. Of course, Arman Ilia is far, far more enticing on paper, and plus Ilia getting a knockout victory or any victory over Arman Tsarukyan is infinitely better for his resume and his overall legacy than a win over Dan Hooker, and I think that's really not up for debate. But the question that I'm left with here is, who's fighting Ilia and when is Ilia fighting? And the answer is that we have no clue, and it probably won't be this year. Unfortunately, I know we were looking at December, anticipating probably an Ilia versus Justin Gaethje fight. Honestly, I would have hated that fight to be made, so I'm glad it won't be made. But if the UFC and Dana White is just holding out to announce that fight at a later date, maybe wait for that new deal to kick in, right? I don't know what they're holding out on, but I mean, it's anything but a good thing to have Ilia this inactive, and I doubt that it's down to his decision-making alone. It has to be him being preserved because he's the biggest star in the sport right now. And I would say it's kind of just a unanimous thing, really. I mean, who really competes with Ilia as far as stardom currently going in the UFC? I don't think anybody else really does. But of course, with this card being in the Middle East, you'd expect it to be extremely stacked, and it is. This is the main event. But we have other banger fights that were announced for this card. I'd like to talk about those too. We have Garry versus Belal Muhammad. Now, I don't love the matchup, in all honesty. I would have liked to see Belal Muhammad versus Kamaru Usman. I think the fact that the UFC hasn't pushed for that fight at all is weird to me, because there's built-in beef between these two. The trash talk would be hilarious. They have a history together, right? That infamous, mythical fucking podcast episode, which Usman will not put out because everything that Belal says about it is probably true. You know, I definitely would have preferred to see Garry versus Sean Brady. I think that would be a true number one contenders fight. But then again, maybe this is an indication that we'll end up getting Kamaru Usman versus Sean Brady. But then in that case, man, how do you even choose a contender for the winner of JDM versus Islam, man? There are so many rightful contenders right now currently fighting at welterweight, and it's kind of a good problem to have, right? It's better than the situation in most other divisions where there just is no clear-cut contender because nobody wants to fucking risk their spot in the first place. But yeah, at least we have a bunch of Chad 170-pounders and Chad 185-pounders who are actually willing to take risks in the modern MMA game, which is a fucking rarity, unfortunately. And I have to say this right now, right? I've shit on Ian Garry on this channel on multiple occasions, called him a cuck, and, you know, many other expletives that he probably deserves to be called. But I have to say that Ian Garry has done such a bang-up job in turning around his public image by just taking fights. Ian Garry has it right. If you're an unlikable person, if your personality is nothing to write home about, and in fact, every time you open your mouth, people want you to shut your fucking mouth, all you can really do is show up to fight, and that's how you gain respect. And he's done that, right? Multiple times, taking fights on short notice, dangerous fights on short notice, and taking the most dangerous matchups in the division and not sitting around crying, acting like he deserves a title shot, like Arman Tsarukyan, for example. So I want to say big ups, Ian Garry. You have turned it around with how game you are, and that's probably the best way to do it in this game. So you know what, Ian Garry? Big respect, big respect. I may not agree with some of the life choices, but that's okay, right? We don't have to agree on every little thing, but you have my respect, and I know that's very important for MMA fighters to have my respect. That's very, very important and something to strive for. So good job. But as far as how I think this fight will go, to my knowledge, it is a 3-rounder, and that definitely favors Ian Garry here. Obviously, Belal, you know what he's going to try and do. He's going to try and walk forward, use his boxing to set up takedowns, and that's really it, right? He's going to use those cannoli hands, try and put him on Ian Garry. But what we've seen from Ian Garry in his last few fights, and I know it was a bad look at the very end of the Prates fight, you know, him doing whatever he could to survive, but man, he really stayed safe. He was able to stay impeccably safe against one of the most dangerous strikers in the division for pretty much 3.5 rounds until Prates started to actually find that jab, and then eventually started to find that left hand and started to bust him up pretty bad. But the performance he was putting on up to that point was so slick, man. The footwork, I don't know if anybody at welterweight currently, aside from maybe Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, maybe MVP of course, has better footwork than Ian Garry. He's well-rounded, right? He's been showing it fight over fight, the improvements in the grappling. Took Shavkat's back for fuck's sake and almost had a rear naked on him, which is nothing to scoff at, really. Even though it is kind of just like a consolation prize because he clearly lost that fight. But he made it very competitive with the guy who many thought would be a guaranteed title holder at some point in the future. But Ian Garry has almost come off better than Shavkat after that loss because I know Shavkat's been dealing with injuries and this and that, so we can't exactly control that. But since then, Ian Garry has taken dangerous fight after dangerous fight, and this is yet another risky one for him, right? Belal, on paper, should be able to take him down and grind him to a decision. But honestly, I think Belal just became champion at the perfect time in his career, and I think we've probably seen the best of him. I think we've seen Belal Muhammad peak, and all that damage he took against JDM could not have helped him whatsoever. It could not have helped him in his ability to absorb shots. Like, he really took a beating off of JDM, and credit to him for being able to absorb all that. But I can't imagine it helping him very much going into a fight against Ian Garry. I could see Ian Garry hurting him, but at the same time, I could see Belal Muhammad controlling him. So this is a really tough one to determine. I think it really has a lot to do with whether or not it's 3 or 5 rounds. That'll kind of dictate where I go with my prediction here. If it's 3-rounder, I 100% think Ian Garry will win. If it's a 5-rounder, I can still see Ian Garry winning, but does lean me in the direction of Belal Muhammad. But aside from those 2 featured fights, man, we even have Alexander Topuria going up against Bezkat Almakan, which is a really cool fight on paper. Of course, I don't know what it is. There's just so much intrigue when it comes to Alexander Topuria stepping in there because he looked so similar to Ilia Topuria, just a lot less polished and I guess you could say less sharp and with less octagon experience, I think is what the main factor was. So he's just a bantamweight version of Ilia, is pretty much what I saw. And because I love watching Ilia fight, I love his fight style. Of course, I want to see Alexander Topuria progress in his career. I want to see it, but this is a really, really tough test for him, man. Bezkat is more proven. He has more experience, right? And he has more experience in the UFC against some decent competition, man. Like, for his first 2 fights to be up against Umar Nurmagomedov, followed by Brad Katona, right, who had never been finished up to that point, and for him to hurt Umar, right, he hurt Umar in the first round and then pretty much forced Umar to become a lay-and-pray merchant for the remainder of that fight, and that was on his UFC debut, and then he became the first person to finish Brad Katona. So I'd say it's been a pretty great start to his UFC career, And then you compare that to Alexander Topuria, who just went to a decision, right, in a somewhat competitive fight with Colby Thickness, man. And it doesn't age very well because Colby Thickness looked like shit in his last fight. I think that was this past week. And he, honestly, to me, did not look anywhere close to UFC level, if I'm being totally real. So that somewhat competitive fight with Colby Thickness, I don't know. It's aging poorly for Alexander, but it's hard to write these fighters off when they don't have any in-octagon experience, man, because we've seen, for example, Merab Dvalishvili early in his career look very vulnerable. Even Ilia Topuria earlier on in his career looked pretty vulnerable against guys that you'd expect him to just starch nowadays, right? So, cannot write off Alexander based off his somewhat lackluster performance against Colby Thickness. But this is such a tough test. This is such a tough test. This might be one of the toughest tests for Alexander Topuria, if not the toughest test outside of the bantamweight rankings. Because Bezcat can crack. He can crack, man. That uppercut is nasty. Overhands are nasty. He might have some of the biggest power at 135. So Alexander Topuria is in big danger here, and I believe that for him to win this one, he will have to lean quite heavily on the wrestling. I believe he'll have to do that, and I believe that he can do it, but I think that Bezcat is just really good. He's just really good, and this might be a little bit too soon for Topuria. This might be a little bit too soon, and we could also have ourselves a little situation where we have like the cheap imitation, for example, right? Where Alexander, he fights like Ilia, aesthetically he looks like Ilia, he moves like Ilia, but in practice it's just not the same, and I think we could see that with Alexander. We could, because he looked a little bit gun shy against Colby Thickness, but then again, as I said, it's his UFC debut, so it's hard to really draw a firm conclusion based off of that performance alone. So this fight really is a big unknown. My early prediction is that Bezcat will get this one done. It pains me to say it, man, because obviously I want to see Alexander go far in the sport, but yeah, early prediction, I'm going to go with Bezcat just because Alexander is such an unknown, and this is quite a big step up in competition from Colby Thickness, like a huge step up in competition. So as things stand, yeah, I'm going with Bezcat, but I'm hoping to be wrong here, and yeah, really, like what it boils down to is that this fight is just one big question mark, and I have no clue how it'll go. But regardless of how it goes, I believe this is one of the highest level fights that we will be able to see from two unranked fighters in the sport right now. Just as far as their skill sets on paper, this should be a really fun one. I'm hoping that it turns out to be a fun one regardless. And yeah, man, that Qatar card is absolutely stacked to the brim. Ian Garry, Bilal Muhammad, we finally have Arman Tsarukyan getting off his ass, putting down the fucking burgers and the sandwiches and the big loaves of bread and oh my god, all the extravagant food that he likes to flex on us with. He's finally putting that down, hopefully, to compete in MMA. Because all he's been giving us in the last year and a half has been grappling matches and begging and whining and complaining and acting like an entitled brat. But he's finally putting his spot on the line. So big ups Arman Tsarukyan, finally. It's about time, right? Like, I know it's a lot to ask for. It seems like a lot to ask for of fighters these days to fucking fight. I know, it seems like a lot to ask for. So, like, any bit of fight news from someone like Arman just gets me completely chubbed. And, yeah, man, I'm excited for the card. Excited for these fights. They're bound to be bangers. Absolutely, guys. Let me know in the comment section below what you think about the fights, what you think about my thoughts on these fights, man. Whatever your thoughts are in life in general, whatever you have to say. Just let me know in the comment section below. And as always, I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you on the next one.